Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I'm going to tell you about Karen who destroyed my bridge. I remember the exact moment I saw my bridge come tumbling down, even though at the time, I couldn't believe it was really happening. I was standing on my porch that overlooked the small creek separating my farmland from the main road, sipping a late afternoon tea and contemplating how I might expand my vegetable garden for the next season. The sky was a perfect shade of pale blue, with just a few wispy clouds that gave the sun a brief interruption. The tranquility of the day was shattered, however, by the violent roar of heavy machinery echoing across my property. My heart dropped when I realized that the sound was coming from the direction of the covered wooden bridge that allowed me and my visitors to cross the creek by foot or smaller vehicles. That bridge was not just a functional structure, it was a cherished piece of my family's history, built by my grandfather decades ago. As soon as I heard the engine rev, I knew something was wrong. I could see dust swirling in the distance, and to my horror, I recognized Karen standing there. She was barking orders at a couple of workers, pointing and yelling that the bridge needed to be demolished because it was dangerous. Karen, with her perpetually disapproving expression, was, unfortunately, the self-appointed authority in our small community. She was always butting into everyone's personal affairs, claiming to represent the homeowners association even outside the actual neighborhood boundaries. The fact that I lived on farmland that was distinctly separate from the rest of the neighborhood did not, apparently, deter her from meddling in my business. My heart pounded. I dropped my mug right there on the porch, not even noticing that it shattered at my feet, and rushed over to see what was happening. But by the time I got close enough to shout, part of the roof of the bridge was already down in a crash of splintered wood. Dust rose in a thick cloud and Karen's voice cut through the chaos. "Keep going! I'm making this safe for everyone!" I yelled over the machinery for them to stop. I remember my voice cracking from either fear or rage, maybe both. My mind spun with questions. How had she gathered these workers? How had she convinced them to tear down my bridge, which stood on my private property without any formal permission? Who in their right mind would go along with destroying someone else's structure like that? When I finally got close enough, I practically had to shove my way through. The workers stopped briefly, seeing the fury in my eyes. I demanded to know who gave them the authority to demolish my bridge. One of the workers, a middle-aged man who looked both bewildered and embarrassed, stammered something about being hired by the local homeowner association's representative. That representative, of course, was Karen. She had apparently told these guys that the bridge was an imminent safety hazard and part of public property. Because it was public, she claimed she had the right to call in demolition for the safety of the community. I was so mad I could barely speak. I forced myself to take a breath, and I told the workers to cease everything immediately. Before they could act on my demand, Karen started shrieking that they had to continue because she knew best. She shouted that the old wooden boards were rotted and that she was saving me from an expensive lawsuit if the bridge collapsed on somebody. Mind you, no one else uses that bridge except me and my invited guests. The creek below it is entirely within my property lines. I had done maintenance on that bridge regularly, even though it was old, and it was perfectly safe. Maybe it didn't look brand new, but it had been stable for years. Amid this chaos, Karen produced some flimsy claim that my property boundary ended halfway across the creek, and that the rest was neighborhood property. It made zero sense, because my deed and my boundary markers show quite clearly that the creek and the entire crossing are within my farm's land. She insisted, though, that she had the right. The workers, clearly confused by conflicting orders, finally shut off their machinery when they saw me glaring at them and heard me threaten to call the authorities. Even so, at that point the damage was done. The main support beams were broken in multiple sections, and a huge chunk of the bridge was lying in a pile of splintered wood on the grass. My heart sank. Decades of history and a vital crossing to my farm had just been destroyed by this meddling neighbor who decided she was the arbiter of everyone else's property rights. I was so furious I was shaking. There were a million things I wanted to say to her, but I tried to keep my composure. I told Karen plainly that even if she thought it was going to fall down, she had absolutely no legal right to demolish my bridge. She was looking at me like I was a toddler throwing a tantrum, and that condescension nearly pushed me over the edge. "Well, I saved you from liability," she snapped. "You should be thanking me. I'm part of the homeowners association and we are responsible for the welfare of this community." Now, Keep in mind that my farm was technically grandfathered outside of the official neighborhood boundaries. The farmland was there long before the development sprang up around it, and my family had always chosen to remain separate from the HOA. This was known to everyone, but apparently Karen wanted to rewrite history. I told her to leave my property immediately and that I was calling the sheriff's department. That's when Karen whipped out her phone and pretended to make a call to the HOA board. Within an hour, sure enough, a couple of individuals I recognized from the neighborhood arrived, acting as if they were official spokespersons for some kind of authority. They started going on about how the bridge was a hazard to the entire community and needed to be replaced with something that the HOA approved. I was in complete disbelief. I showed them the property lines on the official survey, complete with the stamps from the county records. I pointed out that the creek was entirely on my private land. One of them, a timid fellow named Rudy, squinted at the documents but looked uneasy, as though he realized they were in the wrong. The other, a more brazen individual named Dan, argued that the association had been granted some sort of easement. I told them that there was no easement for the creek or the crossing. If there was, where was the official document? Of course, they had nothing to show. They just kept insisting the HOA had a right to intervene. By this point, I had already contacted the county sheriff's office, and I was waiting for a deputy to come out and sort this out. In the meantime, Karen was walking around my property, pointing out other things she deemed out of compliance, like my old storage barn that needed a fresh coat of paint, or my orchard fence that wasn't the standard height the HOA mandated in the neighborhood. She was making notes on a clipboard. I kid you not. She seemed to be enjoying the power trip, telling me that my farm buildings and fences also needed to meet the HOA standards. I told her in no uncertain terms that she was mistaken, that my land was outside HOA jurisdiction, and that she should step off my property. Instead, she continued to lecture me on the rules and started reciting random lines from some thick binder. I recognized it as the neighborhood rules and regulations. I had never agreed to them, so it was bizarre to see her trying to impose them on me. Finally, the deputy arrived. He was a respectful, calm officer named Jeff, who had grown up in a nearby community and was very familiar with the area. Before even speaking to me at length, he walked around, surveyed the half-destroyed bridge, took some notes, and then asked each party for their side of the story. Karen immediately launched into a tirade about how the bridge was unsafe, that she was authorized to handle community hazards, and that her association had complete legal ground to do so. Jeff listened calmly, asked if she had any documents to prove that the HOA owned or had rights to that part of the land, to which Karen repeatedly responded, "It's in our guidelines." I then showed Jeff my deed and the county's property survey. The difference was stark. My documents were official, from the courthouse, with clear boundaries. Karen's guidelines were basically internal HOA rules that had zero authority over my farm. Jeff nodded sympathetically when he saw my official records and concluded that Karen had no legal right to demolish the bridge. He informed her that she very likely committed property destruction. At that point, Karen seemed to realize she was in hot water. Her tone shifted from that condescending, arrogant voice to one of panic and justification. I was only protecting the community. It looked like it was going to fall any day. She tried to claim that she had done me a favor. Jeff, however, was unimpressed. He told her that even if she believed the bridge was unsafe, she had to go through the proper channels, like filing a complaint with the county or contacting me for permission. Taking matters into her own hands was not acceptable, and she could be on the hook for significant damages. Karen demanded that Jeff do his job and arrest me for insulting her. He just sighed and said, "Ma'am, that's not how the law works. It appears you destroyed a private structure on private property." Then she turned to the other HOA members, insisting they back her up. They both sort of shrugged, and Dan mumbled something about, "We were told it was an emergency hazard." I sensed they were trying to distance themselves from Karen. Meanwhile, I was seething, but at least I felt a small sense of relief that the officer understood the seriousness of what she had done. Unfortunately, the deputy said there would need to be an investigation and that I should file a formal complaint to get the legal process going. I agreed and watched as Karen stormed off, shouting something about how she'd see me in court. The two HOA individuals hurried after her, looking decidedly less enthusiastic than when they arrived. My bridge, though, lay in ruins, and my access to a significant part of my property was compromised unless I wanted to wade across the creek or take a small boat across it. Right after I spoke to Jeff, he told me that because of the creek and the nature of my property, I might have to give an official statement downtown, but it wasn't urgent. He gave me the case number, told me to keep all my documentation, and assured me that there would be follow-up once everything was reviewed by the county's legal office. Meanwhile, I was left with a real logistical problem. I couldn't just drive my truck across to get feed to my animals without some major workaround. I decided I would temporarily use a small aluminum boat I kept for fishing in the pond on the other side of the farm, and ferry supplies that way. It wasn't ideal, but I didn't have much choice. Over the next week, I had a flurry of communication with my insurance company, the county inspector, and eventually my lawyer. The official county inspector came out, took one look at the wreckage, and confirmed that the rest of the bridge was basically beyond saving. Because Karen's demolition folks had ripped out the main supports, it would cost more to rebuild it from scratch than to try to salvage anything. Not only that, but I discovered that Karen had lied to the workers about her authority, telling them this was a sanctioned project by the community manager's office. My lawyer suggested filing civil charges for property damage in addition to the criminal complaint. In the meantime, though, the so-called HOA escalated. They sent me a letter claiming that my property was indeed under their umbrella and that I owed them dues, plus a fine for non-compliance with various neighborhood standards. They enumerated everything from the color of my barn to the height of my fences. I nearly laughed when I read it, because it was so far-fetched. However, it also made me angry that they were still pushing this narrative. This was never an issue before Karen rose to her position. Actually, I'm not even sure how official her role was, but she acted like the HOA president. In all my years of living there, I never had any problem with the association members because we had a mutual understanding that my farm was separate. I took the letter to my lawyer, who raised an eyebrow and said he would write a response. While the legal wheels were turning, Karen kept strutting around, dropping by uninvited to take photos of my property through the orchard fence. She even had the audacity to approach one of my farmhands, telling him he was violating HOA regulations by working outside on a Sunday. My farmhand, Malcolm, was so confused he just stared at her, unsure how to respond. When he told me about it, I reassured him that Karen had no authority over us. Still, her behavior was bordering on harassment. Another interesting development happened about 2 weeks later. The deputy, Jeff, returned with an officer from the county code enforcement. They politely informed me that Karen had filed multiple complaints stating that my property was dangerous. She claimed my barn was about to collapse, that my orchard fence was riddled with rusted nails that could injure passers-by, and that I was storing hazardous materials in my shed. It was a barrage of allegations, every one of them untrue. The code enforcement officer inspected the property thoroughly and found none of her claims valid. He was quite understanding, even amused, but nonetheless had to follow protocol. He took notes, photos, and left, telling me that there was no violation. He did, however, mention that Karen had called the office multiple times, demanding immediate action. It was clear she was on a personal crusade. As the situation continued, my lawyer dug up the relevant state and county laws regarding HOAs. It turned out that the official boundaries were set long ago, and my farm was explicitly outside the association's jurisdiction. He wrote a series of stern letters to the HOA and its alleged board members, insisting they cease their attempts to regulate my property. He also notified them that a civil lawsuit for property damage was in the works. At that point, I discovered a small but crucial detail. The farmland had an older waterway easement belonging to me, which allowed me to maintain the creek crossing. This was actually beneficial because it established with total clarity that I had the right to control anything related to that creek, including the wooden bridge that Karen destroyed. The law was on my side. My lawyer was confident that we had an ironclad case against Karen and possibly against the HOA if they supported her actions. While we geared up for the lawsuit, I decided to speed up the process of rebuilding the bridge. However, my lawyer advised me to first have multiple estimates done so that any potential settlement or court order would include the correct amount of damages. I had 3 different contractors come out to give me quotes, and the average cost was staggering, way more than I expected, because apparently the cost of lumber and specialized labor had gone up significantly. I recall telling the contractors the backstory, and their eyes widened at how brazen Karen was to just tear down someone's private structure. They all said they had never heard of such an extreme case of overreach by a homeowners association. One of them even told me about a time he'd done work in a neighborhood where the HOA insisted on approving the color of roofing shingles for every house, but he had never heard of an HOA forcibly demolishing a structure that wasn't even on its property. It made me feel both validated and frustrated at the same time. Meanwhile, tension in the community was running high. Some neighbors reached out to me apologetically, saying they had no idea Karen was going to do something so drastic. A few folks even offered to help me with manual labor to rebuild a temporary footbridge if needed. But ironically, a handful of staunch HOA supporters, friends of Karen or people who believed in the strict standards, kept parroting the line that my bridge was a hazard and that the association was only doing the responsible thing. It felt like a mini civil war in that area, with half the neighbors appalled by Karen's actions and the other half trusting the HOA blindly. Things really escalated when the sheriff's department completed their investigation and a district attorney got involved. Apparently, it wasn't just a little property damage. The cost of replacing the bridge was in the tens of thousands of dollars, and the emotional aspect of losing a family structure was significant. Plus, the fact that Karen had deceived a crew of workers into demolishing private property under false pretenses made the legal ramifications even more serious. Soon, the authorities told me they were considering pressing criminal charges against Karen, potentially a felony charge depending on how the details played out in court. Karen must have sensed the danger because she suddenly started acting very nice. She came by one morning, unannounced of course, and tried to speak to me in a friendly tone about how maybe we could work something out and come to an amicable solution. I told her calmly that she'd already had the chance to approach me about her concerns, but instead she had chosen to tear down my bridge without permission. She mumbled something about how she didn't want to go to court, that it was all a misunderstanding. I simply informed her that my lawyer would be in touch and suggested she leave my property. She didn't take it well and stomped off, her attempt at a smile vanishing the moment she realized I wasn't budging. Less than a week later, I received a call from the sheriff's office. They told me that a warrant for Karen's arrest had been issued on charges related to property destruction and fraud. Apparently, the investigators had gathered enough evidence that she had knowingly misrepresented her authority to the demolition crew and deliberately destroyed my property. I won't lie, I felt a jolt of satisfaction, but also a little bit of shock. It's not every day you see a neighbor face criminal charges of that magnitude. The arrest didn't happen in some dramatic standoff. Karen turned herself in with her lawyer by her side. However, it made local headlines in our small community that a high-ranking member of a homeowners association was arrested for destroying private property. The shockwaves reached the other board members, who started an emergency meeting to figure out how to distance themselves from this fiasco. After all, Karen had told them she was acting under the auspices of the HOA, which might make them liable as well. The more prudent members realized that they had absolutely no legitimate claim to my land, and that supporting Karen would spell disaster for the entire association. As the pre-trial phase progressed, my lawyer and I discovered even more interesting facts. It seemed that Karen had been bullying not just me, but multiple neighbors, forcing them to follow arbitrary rules that weren't even in the official HOA guidelines. She had even levied fines against certain households, but pocketed the money for administrative fees. A few brave neighbors stepped forward with statements, revealing that Karen had threatened them with lawsuits if they didn't pay. The intimidation tactics were so intense that some folks paid her just to avoid conflict. This obviously put the entire HOA under scrutiny, as those members who allowed it to continue or turned a blind eye were now in hot water for failing to oversee her conduct. The day finally came when there was a hearing to discuss the multiple charges. I was present in the courtroom, along with a few other folks from the neighborhood. Karen looked deflated, not at all like the arrogant presence she once exuded on my property. Her lawyer made an argument that she was overzealous in protecting the community from a perceived safety threat, but that obviously didn't hold much water, given the property lines and the legal evidence. The prosecutor read out a list of things Karen had done: misrepresenting her authority, destroying private property, hiring workers under false pretenses, harassing neighbors, and possibly extorting money through bogus fines. It was surreal to see the downfall of someone who had once marched around with a clipboard and a grin of superiority. The prosecutor hammered home that if she had a legitimate concern about safety, she could have gone to the county or the actual property owner, me, or a licensed inspector, instead of orchestrating a demolition in such a reckless manner. Karen ended up pleading no contest to several charges, including property destruction. Her sentence was somewhat up in the air for a while, but the judge took a tough stance, pointing out the scale of the damage and the pattern of her intimidating behavior. When it all was said and done, Karen received a 6-year prison sentence. That was heavier than I had originally expected, but given the circumstances, especially once the financial extortion and repeated harassment of neighbors were factored in, it wasn't entirely shocking. In the immediate aftermath, the HOA board faced a massive scandal. Officials and attorneys demanded audits of their finances. When it became clear that Karen had used her position, official or otherwise, to collect unauthorized fees, the trust in the HOA disintegrated completely. Other board members resigned in disgrace, insisting they had no idea she was abusing her power to that extent. However, the membership at large was so angry and embarrassed that they voted to disband the association entirely. From what I heard, they dissolved the legal entity of the HOA within a few months, returning governance to some simpler neighborhood agreement. The fiasco had turned so many residents against the very concept of an association that it was unsustainable to keep it going. Now, on the personal side, I did eventually get my new bridge. I had to coordinate with contractors, get all the permits in order, and pay for it up front. Luckily, I was able to recoup the majority of my costs through the subsequent civil suit. Karen, or rather Karen's estate, since she had to liquidate a lot of her assets, ended up compensating me for the reconstruction expenses. It didn't bring back the sentimental value of my grandfather's original bridge, but at least I could once again drive across the creek to access my farmland. One interesting part of the aftermath was the boat rides to and from the property. The last time I used the boat, I was accompanied by 2 officers from the sheriff's department as we did a final review of the damage site. It felt almost cinematic, sitting in a little aluminum boat, gently rocking in the creek, while a uniformed officer peered over the remains of the old structure, snapping photos. We all knew that the case was heading toward a strong conclusion, and they wanted to be absolutely thorough. I took that moment to reflect on how unbelievably surreal it was that a simple wooden bridge, which had stood quietly for decades, became the center of such a storm. After Karen was sentenced, I remember receiving phone calls from a few neighbors who had once sided with her. They apologized, explaining that they genuinely believed Karen was looking out for them. She had seemed so sure of herself, so confident that the rules were on her side, that they just assumed she must know what she was talking about. The swiftness with which everything came crashing down was a lesson to them. Always double-check the facts, especially when it comes to someone else's private property. The end of the homeowners association also ushered in a new sense of cooperation in the neighborhood. Without the overbearing rules, people started talking to each other more openly. If someone had a concern about a fence line or a tree branch overhanging a yard, they just knocked on the door and had a polite conversation about it. A few of the older residents commented that it felt like the old days, when neighbors solved problems with each other rather than involving layers of bureaucracy. Granted, the dissolution of the HOA did mean that some communal areas, like the small park at the center of the neighborhood, needed a new management structure, but the residents eventually formed a volunteer committee that took care of the park without making it an official association with power over private properties. As for me, life gradually returned to normal. I poured myself into rebuilding parts of my farm. I repainted my storage barn, replaced a section of my orchard fence, and even expanded my vegetable fields. I still miss the look and feel of the old wooden bridge. There was something special about its rustic charm, but the new one serves its purpose well. It's sturdier, and I have peace of mind that it meets modern safety standards. Occasionally, I drive over that bridge and glance at the creek below, reminded of the drama that once played out there. Sometimes it almost feels like a distant memory, but every now and then, I'll see a neighbor strolling by the far edge of my property, looking a bit sheepish, as though they remember too, the time everything went haywire because of one individual's insatiable need for control. I've heard from various sources that Karen's life behind bars isn't particularly pleasant. She apparently tried to appeal her sentence, but given the strong evidence and witness testimony, she didn't have much luck. She may have genuinely believed that she was doing something good for the neighborhood in her own twisted way, but the law doesn't see it that way. You can't just destroy property because you personally deem it unsafe, especially when the real motive seemed to be more about controlling someone else's land than genuine concern. On a broader level, I think this whole ordeal taught everyone a lesson about boundaries. both literal and figurative. The boundary lines of my property are what they are, and no amount of HOA guidelines can supersede actual deeds and county records. The boundary between neighborly concern and intrusive meddling is also something people should be mindful of. If Karen had come to me with her worries about the bridge and suggested we have it inspected, who knows? Maybe we could have found common ground, but she made her choice, and it cost her dearly. I've also become more appreciative of local law enforcement and the legal system in this matter. The deputies were patient, thorough, and fair. My lawyer was incredibly helpful, guiding me through the confusion of navigating property law, civil suits, and criminal proceedings. It's easy to become cynical about whether justice really prevails, but in this case, the outcome was fair to me and, I believe, to the community as well. Life on the farm is peaceful again. I've added a new scarecrow to my crop fields that my nephew thinks is the coolest thing ever. I've set up a small roadside stand for fresh produce, now that access is no longer an issue. Folks from around the region come by on weekends to buy tomatoes, sweet corn, and apples, often remarking on how scenic the place is. A few of them remember the old stories about the destroyed bridge, but are happy to see I've rebuilt. Some of the neighbors who once were under the thumb of the HOA stop by just to chat. They seem relieved that the neighborhood is governed by common courtesy instead of Karen's arbitrary commands. Occasionally, I'll get a question from a visitor. So is this place still in the homeowners association? It always makes me grin. I explain politely that my farm was never in it to begin with, and that the association itself no longer exists. People usually blink in surprise, and then I might share a bit of the saga if they press for details, though I keep it pretty general. There's no need to rehash every moment of that stressful period. It's enough for me to have come out on the other side with my land intact and my rights upheld. When I look at the new bridge, I still wish it had the same timeless aesthetic of the old one, with its wooden beams and the echoes of family history. But the new structure has its own significance now. It represents a stand I took for my rights, a stand I took against someone who believed she could impose her will unilaterally. It's a symbol of the resilience and determination needed to protect what's yours, legally and ethically. I didn't back down, and in the end, justice was served. Friends, thank you. See you soon.